Oh, what's going on? Where the hell is... I'm not sure why this is happening. All right, we're back again. I'm going to try and share screen again. All right. That's really strange. It's asking me to launch meeting, which I've already done. This is really weird. All right, try. Oh, okay. Okay, can you see that? I think we've got it. Okay, so I've put the words architectural styles twice at the top of the slide. Can you figure out why? What's the difference between the two?
They're two different styles.
Yeah, two different styles. Can you identify?
The one on top is a little bit more like older fashioned, sort of medieval.
Yeah,
But the one on the bottom is much more modern.
yeah. It's either modern or ancient, one of the two. Yeah, architectural styles at the top. That's a kind of Gothic style. It's medieval, and the other one is so classical, if you like. So I call this building the built environment, reading the built environment. And you can see below two buildings built within, I don't know, 20 years of each other. I mean, almost contemporary. And you can see enormous differences between the two. I guess you recognize them. Anyone?
I recognize the Big Ben on the right.
Yes. So what's the whole complex?
The building of Parliament?
Yeah, Houses of Parliament. There's something that's called
Yeah.
the Palace of Westminster, or the Houses of Parliament, right? Yeah. And on the left, you may know this, may not. This is obviously a huge building. Anyone take a guess? That's the British Museum. So we have a museum, a classical style, and government building in Gothic style, built almost at the same time, 20 years difference. So clearly, you know, certainly in the early 19th century, stylistic difference was a big deal. So various ways to know a city. So we're going to look at the city as a physical environment. So important to try and read, you know, strata within it. And you know, architecture. You think of different kinds of language even within the built environment. The city speaks to you. How can you understand it? Well, here's a rather extraordinary example. Side by side, two buildings, one from the early 19th century, one from the later 19th century, and you can see enormous differences sort of banged up against each other. One is classical on the left, and one is Gothic on the right. So these stylistic elements collide with each other rather often. Okay, so Christopher Wren is a big name in all this. One of really the great architects of European history, certainly of British history. And one of the interesting things about Wren is that he does all these churches, over 50 churches, as part of the rebuilding of London in the 17th century. But he is the first architect, really, in the history of the world to deliberately use distinct styles as options. So we walk around the city. What you're looking at is Wren's attempt to provide contrast, provide variety. So if you look at the two buildings on the screen, you see the top is Gothic, sort of Gothic. It's not real Gothic, it's Wren's Gothic. And below, there's a sort of a Gothic tower, actually, which is probably what was left behind after the fire. But you can see the building itself is entirely classical. So this is an enormously important break in the history of architecture, not just in England, but actually globally. All right, so we can look at some medieval stuff. Have any of you ever taken a course in medieval art or architecture? Not architecture, but medieval art? No one? Okay. Well, we're going to look at three different things. First is what's called Romanesque. It's called Romanesque because it's like Roman, has round arches. In Britain, it's often called Norman. Norman, if you like, is the English or the British version of Romanesque, which is a European style. Gothic is also an international style. It starts in France, of course. But it's interesting that in Britain there's a very distinctive version of Gothic, and of course it changes a lot in the course of the 4 centuries that it's being used. And then in the 18th century, especially in the 19th, people go back to Gothic, to Romanesque too to some extent, but especially Gothic. And we saw that with the Houses of Parliament, for example. So this is an important phase. So perhaps the most famous Norman building in England is this, the part of the Tower of London. It's called the White Tower because it was originally, I guess, whitewashed. So no one could mistake it. It was built, of course, as an instrument of domination. The Normans conquered Britain in 1066, famously, imposed their rule on the whole kingdom, but to some extent they let London be. But they wanted to intimidate the Londoners. They wanted Londoners to go on trading and creating wealth, but they also wanted to impose domination on them. So that's what this building was about. You notice the round arched windows, fairly small in relationship to the amount of wall, the very strong buttresses. It's a powerful building. That's looking at it closer. You see the strength of the building, the strength of the buttressing, and the relative size of the windows compared to the wall. And this is an amazing part of the tower. It's the chapel, which had various obviously uses. But one thing it did have, which was interesting, is when someone was inaugurated into an order of knighthood, that person, that man, had a special bath and then had to spend the night in vigil in this chapel. And you can see it's, again, this very strong architecture, massive architecture, thick walls, huge cylindrical piers. These between the column and the arch is what's called the capital, which is a sort of cushion, a sort of bulky thing that presses out as if it's a cushion on a couch. It's very simple in this iteration, but extremely powerful. The other great Norman building that exists still in London is the Church of St. Bartholomew the Great in Smithfield. It's actually the oldest parish church. It's 12th century, and it has survived all sorts of disasters. It survived the Great Fire. It survived World War II. Did anyone pick this building, by the way? No. And it was founded by this rather extraordinary character, Gurahir, who seems to be a jester. He's part of the court of King Henry I, who was the son of William the Conqueror. And so he's a cleric as well, but so a major figure at court. And he goes to pilgrimage, and when he's in Rome, he's sick. He falls ill. And he has a dream that Saint Bartholomew appeared to him and told him to found a church and a hospital in his name in Smithfield. So he gets back to London, and he finds out that the place the saint told him to build the church belonged to the king. But then the king said, oh, fine, do it. And Rahir built his hospital, and in fact, it still exists. It's called Bart's Hospital to this day. And the church, of course, also still exists as well. There's another church actually within the hospital itself. And as you see, the church is much altered during the centuries, and the Reformation, part of it is destroyed. So this is the front. You can see it's a wonderful gatehouse, 16th century, and beneath it is an arch. It's actually a Gothic arch. That's the original entrance into the church. As you can see, looking through it on the right, there's another entrance to the church further back. So what happened is that this whole part of the church was demolished under Henry VIII. But you go through this wonderful gatehouse, which was discovered after Second World War. There was bomb damage here, and there had been, a facade in front of it, which was destroyed by the bombing. So this was revealed during wartime. And here's the interior. Have any of you seen Four Weddings and a Funeral? Or heard of it even? Okay, it's one of the fantastic film. Made about the same time as Love Actually, which you probably have seen. Anyway, this church is used a lot in films of various kinds and TV shows. Again, the two lower stories are Romanesque. You can see the massive wall, the round arches. On the lower floor, they're pushed up in a kind of horseshoe shape, a little bit like Islamic arches. But the whole place is kind of rather wonderful. Very a bit gloomy, of course, because in Romanesque churches you don't have much light. So there's a third story, which is actually Gothic, where the light comes in. That's what it looks like during the Christmas service, which is a wonderful occasion in this church. In the cloister, there are, this is of course Gothic. You see the pointed arches, the windows have grown, filled with what's called tracery. The vault is different. It's not see in the church, we just go back for a bit. You can see the arch here, the vault here. You can see there's first of all, it's very massive, but it's also of course round arched. And in the cloister, you've got ribs instead of just a simple vault. Now, this is a very interesting space because in the 18th century, this whole place had become turned over to all sorts of different commercial uses. And actually, there was a printing operation here. One of the printers was a guy called Benjamin Franklin, who came over from Philadelphia and found a job working in this very space before, of course, he goes back to America and becomes a founding father. The moment when he was here, he was just this, this guy making a living. Probably with a funny accent in the view of his Cockney co-workers, I imagine. So just very quickly look at this. I don't know, are people familiar with the differences between Romanesque and Gothic? The Romanesque vault is what's called a barrel vault. It's round, right? Cylindrical. And it meets at what's called a groin. right? Which is like an edge between two pieces of walling. It's heavy, it's thick, it's very strong, but the only way to build this thing is by putting scaffolding underneath to hold it up until it all locks into place. Gothic vault is made up of ribs. Now, the thing about ribs is that you can build them first, as you can see here on the right, and then you fill them in. So it's a much quicker, more economical way of building. And of course, the ribs themselves have decorative value. And the arches are pointed, as I've mentioned. And if you have a pointed arch, you can change the inclination, if you like. You can have a sharp pointed or a less sharp pointed arch, doesn't matter. Whereas with a Romanesque arch, they always have to be round. And at the top where the ribs meet, there's what's called a boss. That's also a place where you can put in ornaments. Now, there were two huge medieval churches in London, medieval London. One is St. Paul's Cathedral, which of course no longer exists. It was burnt in the fire. That was the seat of the Archbishop of London. And Westminster Abbey, which was a monastery, which became the coronation church and the burial church of many monarchs. So this is Westminster Abbey. Looking at this is a medieval part. The towers, by the way, of Westminster Abbey are 18th century. They're not medieval. So you see the turrets. You can see the way the wall is pulled away, is carved away. So the windows get bigger and bigger. The windows on this facade are relatively small, but you can see to the sides larger windows popping out. So the wall is being carved away, replaced with glass. And there's this huge rose window which fills this space between the two buttresses. A Gothic cathedral has typically enormous porches. You can see there are 3 porches here with sculpture, ornamented with sculpture, which is a major feature of these churches. We go into the abbey. It's very tall by English standards. One of the interesting differences between France and England in the medieval period is that the French build high, incredibly high, ridiculously high, to the point that some of their high vaults collapse. But they go for height, whereas the English go for length. Now this is high because the architect here was actually French, so you have this very strong French influence. And one thing to remember is that at this moment in the 13th century, the French, the elite in England, the governments, the royal family spoke French. They were, to all intents and purposes, French. Sorry, I won't do that. So this is a kind of, but the craftsmen, obviously, many of them were English. So you have this interesting, sort of mingling of French and English ideas. One English idea is the use of this almost black marble, contrasting with the limestone above it. That's a very English thing to do. And looking up at the vault, the high vault, you can see the bosses with all kinds of heraldic symbols and so on them, coats of arms, and the ribs. One thing to notice is that you have ribs, a number of ribs, some of which are functional. So the main rib going across is functional, the rib going transversely is functional. The one between is just ornamental. So the rib becomes an opportunity, for fancy design. And then there's this wonderful chapter house, which is where the monks sat around and met in this little octagonal building. And it's has a central column. It's a composite column. You can see it's made up of a number of smaller elements, which then transform themselves into ribs and reach out to the various faces of this building. And you can also see how the windows now occupy so much space. The wall has almost completely disappeared, has been replaced by glass. In a typical Gothic transformation. So just very quickly to give you an idea, the history of window design is quite remarkable. You know, Norman or Romanesque, very simple, round arch. What's called early English in the 12th century is again fairly simple, but you get a couple of sort of smaller windows put together, gradually forming a larger pattern. And then in the 13th and 14th centuries, oh, hell breaks loose, and you get these extraordinary designs of what's called tracery. These small elements of stone that are used to separate panels of glass. But these are extraordinarily elaborate. And then in the course of the 14th century, order is reestablished, and this kind of excessive ornament, as you might think, is then replaced by more disciplined and orderly patterning. And then in the 16th century, the late 15th, 16th century, so-called Tudor style, I mean, you get this extraordinary outburst, especially in the vaults, of very complex engineering. This is at the end of Westminster Abbey. It's the chapel of Henry VII, the first Tudor king. And it is totally amazing with these extraordinary elements called pendentives hanging down. As you walk in, you see all this stone hanging over your head. All kinds of complexity of vaulting and tracery. Unfortunately, they of course also hang all these banners of army regiments, which makes it a little bit hard sometimes to see the architecture. But it's one of the most amazing spaces actually in Europe. Another great Gothic space actually still exists in Westminster Palace. All that's left of the medieval palace is this enormous hall, a great hall with this extraordinary timber roof. Of course, Britain was always a land of seafarers, shipbuilding. So there was incredible skill in carpentry. So the guys who built ships could very easily come in and build a vault like this. But this is a quite extraordinary space. That's it there on this building here on the right. Is the hall, and the abbey, of course, off to the right. That structure sticking out the back of the abbey is the Henry VII chapel. Just a quick look at Old St. Paul's, which was a remarkable building, a very famous building. Had this enormous spire, extremely long. You can see the English preoccupation with length is very much apparent here. The nave, the front part is actually mostly Norman, Romanesque. The back part is Gothic. So you have the two major medieval styles kind of combined or colliding, perhaps rather, in this building. In the inside, the great feature was the east window. The whole of one of the things that you have in English architecture is the ends of buildings tend to be square. The French like curves, the English like square. So here's a square end with the wall filled with this amazing window, this famous window. As you can see on the left from the inside, on the right from the outside. And it was a sight, you know, so people came, you know, it was one of the sights of London while the building existed. There it is again in a digital reconstruction. It's gone, but there is a church still standing in the city of London, which was on the east side of the city, so it escaped the fire. which has an east window, which seems to recall, probably deliberately, the east window of Old St. Paul's. You can see the great rose window. But you see the rose actually the rose is circular, but it actually fills a square space, so that the original rose windows are sort of round. This is a round pattern, if you like, fitted into a large square with the various what are called lancet windows, single windows beneath it. Tudor architecture. We looked at Henry VII's chapel. Of course, Henry VIII, very famous for all sorts of reasons, not always all of them good ones. This is Henry's great palace, actually, which he took over from his chancellor, out at a place called Hampton Court, down the Thames, west of London on the Thames. It's built in brick, which the Tudor builders like to use. It's got many Gothic features. It's 16th century, and this was built at the same time. Michelangelo had painted the Sistine Chapel and doing the ceiling and so on. So it's incredible. There's this lag between Britain and the rest of Europe, which is much more advanced at the time. That's the entrance. Again, you can see all kinds of Gothic features, especially you see the window above the entrance, but there are also here and there little Renaissance features. I think you can see it on the little towers to either side of the entrance. There's a round element. Those are Renaissance elements. Those are actually done by an artist, a sculptor from Italy, whose name was Pietro Torrigiani. Has anyone heard of Pietro Torrigiani? Is he a name to anybody? Well, what do you know about Michelangelo's appearance? How would you know Michelangelo if you met him in the street? There's something that happened to him. Does anyone remember?
He was blind, right?
Sorry?
Was he blind?
No, he wasn't blind. As a young man, he was working in a studio with another young man called Pietro Torrigiani. They had a fight, and Pietro broke Michelangelo's nose. So for the rest of his life, if you saw Michelangelo, his nose is kind of bashed in. So Pietro, once you've broken Michelangelo's nose, it's not a good career move, let us say. So Pietro goes off to England, and he ends up designing the tomb of Henry VII in the chapel of Henry VII. So you can see in the background Gothic windows, and in the foreground, high Renaissance sculpture with cupids and classical columns and so on. It's an amazing contrast. So that's the guy who broke Michelangelo's nose. So now we come to an extraordinary fellow called Inigo Jones, who brings about a revolution in English architecture. So being, as you saw at Hampton Court and elsewhere, there's some tentative interest, if you like, in what's happening on the continent of Europe, especially in Italy and France. Interest in classical architecture, the architecture of the Romans, etc. But the English get nowhere with this. They're all very provincial, very behind the times, until Inigo Jones comes along, and he does this building. Now you saw Hampton Court with all the turrets and spires, right, and pinnacles and buttresses, and here is a house which is as simple, as plain as you can imagine, and it's totally revolutionary in that sense, because what matters here is not the elaboration of the building, it's not the display of precious materials, it's the exact proportions. It's about number. It's about it's about ratios. Quite simple ones actually. You know, cubes and half cubes and so on. And this is actually the main front. This is the front that faces the River Thames. And you see there's not even a major entrance here. You're going through the, you know, there's no obvious entrance. There's a stair going up, but you know, I guess you get through here, but it's hard to, you can't see that. So everything is very understated. You can also see the central section pushes forward a little bit, so there's a slight variation in the wall. There's a balustrade up above. There are no you know, pitched roofs any longer. No great tiled roofs. Everything is very geometrical. I don't know what you think about it, but it's you know, it's a kind of radical departure from what had been happening in England, and what actually was happening right in front of this building, where there was a Tudor palace, which doesn't last very long. This is the other front on this right. You can see there's a portico. This faces a park. It still faces a park, so that this portico was an area, a sort of loggia for you know, you could sit there and admire the view. There were deer there. There were sheep, you know, trees and grass and so on. Not long ago, when during the London Olympics, they had the equestrian events here. So again, you can see the emphasis on this sort of white wall, the emphasis on proportionality, sort of a rhetoric of austerity in a way for a monarch, for a monarch's wife, actually two successively, the wives of James I and Charles I. This is what it looks like now. You can see we're in the park. You can see how the building looks out over the park. And then beyond it, there's palatial structure divided into two, and the river beyond. Where there's a sort of gap, as you can see, between the Queen's House and the river. That's where the great Tudor palace once stood. And then in the 17th century and 18th century, they built this huge structure. It's actually a naval hospital, kind of building for old sailors, kind of dockyards near here. And they left open the space between them so that there would be a view of the Queen's House from the river. So it had this incredible reputation, sort of status. Another crazy thing about it, actually, is you can see this colonnade going through it. Originally, that was a public street. One of the functions of this building was as a bridge, so you could get from the palace to the park without actually crossing the road. So you go into this palace, into the Queen's House, up to the second floor, across and down, and you didn't have to actually. You didn't have to risk being hit by a wagon or whatever else was going along the public road. By the way, in the distance, this is this kind of new downtown built in the Docklands, only in the last 50 years or so. Total transformation of this area, which we'll be talking about later on. So just to show you where we are, here's the City of London in the middle. The city, as defined it last time, the business district. And then you see this huge curve made by the river on the east. And below the curve is Greenwich. That's the Greenwich Palace here and the Queen's House, part of that complex. All right, what's so special about Inigo Jones and how did he become what he was, what he became? Well, Jones was fortunate enough to be able to go to Italy several times. I had various, important patrons who paid for him to go to Italy. Now, going to Italy in the 17th, 18th centuries was a major ritual, especially of the elite, the aristocracy. It's called the Grand Tour. You went to Italy, you went to France maybe as well, maybe even Germany, but you went mainly to Italy, mainly to Rome, where you were introduced to ancient culture that was left of ancient Rome, to the Italian language, and to some extent to, of course, to the new stuff, the new Renaissance and Baroque art and architecture of the time. So Jones goes there, he buys a book, a copy of Palladio's treatise, which is called The Four Books of Architecture. So he carries it around with him, and when he goes to many of Palladio's buildings, and he makes notes, actually in his copy of this book. And who was Palladio? Palladio is very much the most influential architect of the Italian Renaissance. Palladianism is a movement named after him. He's really the only architect who has a movement named after him. He's especially known for country houses, so-called villas, but also churches. And Venice, he was city architect. There's a number of fantastic churches he designs there. And some palaces also, of course. In his book, there's the famous studies of ancient Roman buildings. But he also, he's got this big thing about proportion, so he marks in the dimensions, both for the ancient building and for his own. He illustrates his own buildings as well. So, we've talked about this already a bit, but, the point here is, it's a very intellectual approach to building. Proportion and symmetry. You make use of the orders of architecture, we'll come to them in a moment, to the ancient building types, there's temples, of course, and theater, very interested in the theater. And when he gets back, he does a lot of costume designs and designs for scenery. And actually, when Jones gets back, he does that. And then when Jones gets to Italy, he also studies Palladio's theater that he designs in the city of Vicenza, which is his hometown near Venice. So we're going to look quickly at his most famous building, which is often imitated both in England and in the United States, which is the Villa Rotonda near Vicenza, which only has, it has 4 temple fronts, not just one, but 4, and a central dome, as if it was a sacred building. So this is the Villa Rotonda. Photograph on the left, cutaway diagram above, showing you the four porticos, 4 temple fronts leading into a central hall. And above the hall there is a dome. It's a shallow dome as built, but clearly you can see on the right, this is from the Quattro Libri, from the 4 books. You can see Palladio wanted a much more evident semicircular dome. So it's an extraordinary building. Not at all convenient, I would think, for a country house, which had farming functions. But anyway, enormously influential. So this is his book, the four books on architecture, I Quattro Libri dell'Architettura. And it's about theory and practice, and you can see there are 2 young women to either side of the main image. On the left is practice with a set square. On the right is theory with compasses. And sitting up above is the queen virtue, or architecture itself. For the Renaissance, architecture was the ultimate art, which drew on all the other skills and arts. And this down here at the bottom, it says it was published in Venice in 1570. And under the name Quattro Libri, it says what's in the book in capital letters. It says it deals with private houses. There's lots of other things, but private houses, these are the ones designed by Palladio himself, like the Villa Rotonda. One thing you can find out about in this book, as well as other treatises at the time, this is an amazing time for print, because the printing industry is taking off. Printing has only been invented in the 15th century. So printing is becoming very important as a way of transmitting knowledge, especially pictures. You know, text is the same whether you write it or whether you print it. But a picture, it's very hard to reproduce, or you can do it through of course, printing. These are capitals, two different orders, the composite on the left, which is the most elaborate, and the Corinthian on the right. And if you look at the margin on the left, you can see all these little notes. That's Inigo Jones. This is his copy, which he was carrying around with him and making notes as he went. From another major treatise of the time, Serlio, already in 1537, he's publishing this account of the orders. There are five orders. The middle three are Roman. The middle three are Greek. The other two are Roman. And this becomes 17th century to the 19th century. It's a basic reference work. For architects, it's mainly images, and it's about a design language which you can learn, which you can then use, but you can use it in as Serlio makes very clear, you can use it in an inventive and creative way. And already in 1611, there's an English translation of the first part of it. So back to Inigo Jones. Was this anyone's book, building, by the way? Anyone choose this one? This is the Banqueting House in Whitehall. Whitehall, which is, of course, as you know, the center of government in London, in Britain, actually. So it's, again, Inigo Jones, very typical emphasis on proportion, on harmony, symmetry, exquisite detailing. He's used two orders, the Ionic order beneath, the Corinthian order above. You can see the emphasis on the white stone. It was again a totally revolutionary building at the heart of the royal presence in London. It was to be part of a huge palace, which was never built, and of course instead ministries of various kinds get built here instead. So this is a kind of fragment of a great unrealized project. Why was it unrealized? It was unrealized because this building was commissioned by the Stuart King, by Charles I, and he commissioned it as a building which would could match up to European models, to European examples. So there's a ceiling by Peter Paul Rubens, the great Flemish artist, great painter from Flanders who also worked all over Europe. He was a diplomat as well as an artist. And you can see the emphasis on exact detailing for a room that was actually meant to be a kind of theater. The whole idea was to carry out theatrical events called masques, in which the king himself and his court took part. They took roles. In the end, it wasn't used for that because of the ceiling. I mean, the events were lighted by candles, and they were afraid that the candle smoke would damage the wonderful paintings, so they did the masks elsewhere. And it was outside here that the reality, the image of the king and his power that was evoked in these theatrical productions was shattered in 1649, a cold day in February, when King Charles I was led through one of the windows out onto a scaffold, and where his head was cut off. He wore two shirts because he was afraid that he might shiver in the cold, and he was afraid that people would think that he was shivering out of fear, not from cold. What you also see here is the contrast between the classical architecture of Inigo Jones's Banqueting House and the very medieval looking stuff around it. It's actually built not long before. So Charles I is executed. There is a period of the Republican government. Then in 1660, the monarchy comes back in the form of Charles II, the so-called Merry Monarch. Charles had been in exile in France. He knew the French artistic developments very well. And he was very interested in people having a good time, especially himself. So extraordinary growth in theater, in culture. Now, the Republican regime of Cromwell, the Commonwealth, was dominated by Puritans who did not think that theater was a good thing. They thought theater was decadent, that it was hurtful to morality. So they banned theater altogether. Imagine that, just a generation after Shakespeare, banning theater. So theater comes back in a big way. The other thing that's going on is the scientific revolution, new ways of thinking about how you learn about the world. And the key is experiment. So all these rather important figures sort of come up at this time. You will know about Isaac Newton, the theory of gravity, William Harvey, the circulation of blood, and Robert Hooke, who is actually also an architect, who is famous for his use of the microscope. He discovers a whole new world that we hadn't realized was there. And they all formed together in 1660 to form this Royal Society, the advancement of science. So London becomes almost overnight a great center of scientific research. And one of these guys is Wren, Christopher Wren. We know him as an architect, but before he was an architect, he's a famous mathematician, astronomer. He's known for his dissections. So they think of him at the time as kind of wonder of nature, that he was so excellent in so many different fields. So he's the architect of St. Paul's, and again, these 50 churches throughout London, throughout the city of London. The other thing which is going on at this time, which is kind of interesting, is the rise of the coffee house. Coffee, as you know, is a stimulant, wakes you up, lively, and it produced new places. We see this in our own culture, new places where you can talk, where you can learn things, you can engage with people. Although, of course, now people tend to look at their computers, but they didn't have that back in the 17th century. So you have newspapers which are handed around, discussions, the evolution of what's called the public sphere, space for discourse. And so here, Christopher Wren's great achievement, St. Paul's Cathedral, which is a kind of mixture of Renaissance and Baroque design. The pediment, the temple front, is more classical, more Renaissance, and the towers with the diagonal emphasis are Baroque. Extremely impressive building. You see the great length. Paul Wren had to compromise. He wanted a building with a great dome, dominating everything. But the clergy, the priests, what they wanted was a long processional space. That's what they were used to in the English manner. So in the end, he had to compromise. So we have a sort of Renaissance type dome rising above what is essentially a typical English processional space. And this is what it looks like on the inside. Wren, the mathematician, of course, we get this very sort of interesting way he transitions from the circular floor to an octagon, up to a circle again. Very, very complex geometries going on here. And then in the 18th century, already actually in Wren's lifetime, there's a reaction against all this. We go back to Palladium, to Palladianism. And Inigo Jones becomes fashionable again. Strict classicism, time of great growth in British power, in trade. You only need to mention the trade in sugar, etc., and the plantation system in the West Indies, and of course also the control of India. Palladianism therefore becomes a kind of international movement, eventually global perhaps. So the most perhaps striking building of 18th century Palladianism is this. It's called Chiswick Villa. It's built as a kind of architectural set piece. It was sort of attached to a main house, which doesn't exist anymore. It's really for kind of parties. It's for the owner, who's also the builder, who's also the architect, actually, a guy called Burlington, Lord Burlington. Burlington had this dream, this vision of reforming British culture by looking to Italy and also to Inigo Jones. And so this building there becomes a kind of great model for architecture throughout Britain and actually in the American colonies as well. You see the relationship to the Villa Rotonda and some of Palladio's other villas. That's actually a statue of Inigo Jones. Palladio was on the other side. But the interesting thing also about Chiswick Villa is that around the villa, which is very, as you see, very formal, very symmetrical, very classical, there's this extraordinary garden, extraordinary landscape, which is picturesque, as if it's all natural. And the paths are irregular. There are these wonderful water features, rough rocks and so on, very much in contrast with the formality of the house. And one of the things that's going on here is a kind of rejection of French ideas, rationalism, Versailles, everything clipped, everything geometrical. We can't take that. We want nature. The other thing is the interest in China, in Chinese landscape, which of course was which they knew about from ceramics. Very few people actually went to China, but they knew about, on ceramics, on bowls and vases from China, these images of landscape. So that's one thing that's going on here. So you can see very clearly the contrast between this sort of natural seeming landscape and the very formal house. The 18th century has also a period of enormous growth of London, what's called Georgian architecture, the different kings called George. And again, you could see the influence of Palladianism with the classical pediment. These are pilasters, like flat columns. It's very polite. It's rather austere. Again, the emphasis on symmetry and proportion and so on. I'm just showing you this is a club, actually, a gentleman's club where you can go and smoke and drink and play billiards and so on. It's called a Palladian window. Sorry, with a central element which is round arched and then two flat pieces of beam to either side. Or here, the theater, classical temple front in front of a great theater, one of the oldest actually in England, although this is rebuilt, as you see in the early 19th century. And then we have the great debate of the 19th century. There are two sides. Historicists, who use styles from other different periods, sometimes for ideology, sometimes just because you like it. Can be religious ideology, can be political. And there's modernism, the idea that we're in a new age. We need new ideas, we need new styles, new materials. We have new technology. We need to express it. It's not just us to build with new materials and new technology. They need to be expressed. So a whole series of buildings are built without any interest in or gesture towards historicism at all. And by the end of the 19th century, of course, what we have in Chicago is the development of the skyscraper and, you know, the icons of the modern age. So the Houses of Parliament, we've looked at many times before, built in a Gothic style after a fire in 1834. This is part of the brief given to the architect was either to do Tudor or Gothic. The architect chose to do a late phase of English Gothic. And the architect himself, a guy called Charles Barry, had never done anything in Gothic before. He'd done classical stuff. So how did he do this? Well, he was clever enough to hire as a sort of assistant a guy called Pugin, Augustus Pugin, who was a slightly crazy character, obsessed with medieval architecture, obsessed with Gothic. And he got to do the interiors, a lot of the detailing, and he got to design Big Ben, the clock tower. His father was French, so he'd been to France with his father. He had certain sort of international, experience. He was a fervent Catholic, and he hated modern society, hated modern industry, the effect of factories, etc., on human life, human society. So in 1836, soon after he started working at Westminster, he published this extraordinary book called Contrasts, which advocated a return to the quote, faith and social structures of the Middle Ages. And then later on, he published a book on Gothic itself. He actually understood what Gothic architecture was all about. It wasn't just a series of, fancy ornamental features. It was a system, and he understood that. So this is what he did in Westminster. This is the House of Lords, and you can see this very rich, colorful effects. By the way, the House of Commons was destroyed in World War II and had to be rebuilt in a much simplified form. But this is what Pugin had in mind. And this is one contrast. You can see this is the same city, in the 14th century and in the 19th century. In the 14th century, it's dominated by church towers and by, beautiful buildings, by religion, of course, but also by a sense of social order, social community. And then the 19th century city is about exploitation. The church towers have become stumps. There are chimneys everywhere. Where there had been a beautiful kind of almshouse before, here on the right, there's now a prison. So, everything has become cheap and nasty and exploitative. And so we have this kind of social aspect here as well. Here's another, the contrast of a prison and an almshouse, where the poor are treated with dignity and not just locked up. Was first, he's a very young man, 24. I mean, he's very young when he does this. It was real manifesto. This is what architecture should be. This is how we should live. And again, this hatred of the degraded city of his day, the degraded society of his day. So architecture, art could have a moral force. It could actually affect how people live, how people think, how people feel. So we mentioned this already, nationalism and religion. Another thing that's interesting is the Gothic private houses get built. The idea of the house as a quasi sacred space. So this is Pugin again. This is him doing an altar in a rather wonderful. It's a Jesuit church actually, central London. You can see the attempt to bring back the art that existed in Britain before Henry VIII. Before Henry VIII and his men destroyed everything. Broke statues, destroyed paintings. This whole kind of world, a fantastic world of artistic creation which existed until the 16th century. They wanted to bring it back, and this is a very successful example. The Gothic wasn't all the same. There's different kinds of Gothic. This is a very tough church, inner city church, based on actually North German models, brickwork. It's a very small site, also kind of squashed in a bit. What's interesting here is the way they used modern materials, tiles, etc., to create this very rich effect. Again, this harking back to what English culture had once been. Lots of color, lots of extraordinary ornament. Perhaps a culminating monument is the Albert monument, Albert Memorial, in one of the great parks of London. He was the consort of Queen Victoria. We'll come back to him. And of course, the Pre-Raphaelites are a painting, again, a reaction against classical style, against the Renaissance, the High Renaissance anyway. Homes on the left, a classical villa. On the right, a Gothic villa, built within 20, 30 years of each other. Again, this amazing contrast in how you think about the home. The law courts, one of the great Gothic buildings of Europe from the 1870s, just at the entrance of the City of London. Don't have time to say much about it. Here's the interior, the huge hall where you meet your client if you're a lawyer. Very, very impressive. The idea that law should impress you, should take it seriously. Really, that's what's going on here. And now we can look at the non-historicist option. You have time? Yeah, just 10 minutes. So the expression of new technologies, new materials, forms of power, the great building that you should all remember is the Crystal Palace of 1851, which was built to house the Great Exposition, which was essentially the first World's Fair. Goods from all over the world were displayed here in this enormous building built of glass and cast iron. You can see here from the exterior, enormous structure. And huge crowds came, as you can see in the image, extremely popular. You get to see so much of glass and iron inside because there was so much clutter, all sorts of stuff. Here's the Turkish section. You can see all kinds of stuff crammed in. And one thing that was imposed, the condition imposed on the architects, was they had to be able to enclose two or three huge trees in the park, which were much loved. So you can see here the trees underneath the great vault of Crystal Palace. So the interest in using iron and glass, or something they call steel and glass, what you find, of course, in Chicago and skyscrapers. Here's a marvelous example. This is part of the London sewage system, which is an enormously important thing, as we'll see. A pumping station. So the machinery is still there, which is quite wonderful. But this is the kind of main hall with metal architecture, and you can see the profuse ornament, a sense of joy and life, which is in the sewage, the sewage facility. Or some of the markets in London. This is Leadenhall Market in the City of London. Actually, those of you who know Harry Potter might recognize it. It's used a lot in those movies. And you can see it's a great social center, people dining and walking around. And then you can see the two sides of Victorian architecture very clearly in this complex of buildings. What you're looking at, this great extraordinary brick structure with all these pinnacles and towers, is the Railroad Hotel attached to St. Pancras Station. It's now called the Renaissance Hotel. And behind it is the station shed. And in a sense, you have two kinds of architecture side by side. This is the shed in the interior. You see iron and glass. Huge, great expanse without any columns of any sort. And then at the back, it runs up against, you can see the back of the hotel, these Gothic arches. So there's incredible contrast of two ways of thinking about the world, how to express the world we live in. Modernism, of course, in Britain is very slow to arrive, just as Inigo Jones brings in the Renaissance, in a sense, to Britain so much later than almost anywhere else. So modernism arrives late. This is brought in often by people from abroad. Bertolt Lubetkin was from Central Europe, and he got to do some wonderful structures in London just before the Second World War. This is a health center, sort of a medical center. Lots of, again, you see the glass, the steel, these shapes which have nothing to do with anything except function, the function of the building, and of course expression of modernity and what health is all about. So this is the ground plan, but this is the kind of ideology here. You need to let in the sunshine, fresh air. So on the left is a traditional courtyard building, which traps foul air inside it where the sun can't reach. And here you see it's open to the sun, to the air. And there's a cheerful atmosphere, which Lubetkin thought was important. Not just for people, but also for penguins. Lubetkin got to do this extraordinary building in London Zoo, which is the penguin pool, concrete. It's a wonderful sculptural thing with these walkways for the penguins to walk up and down on, which they liked doing until it turned out that the poor penguins were suffering from the concrete. Was kind of was rotting a bit or coming loose and hurting their feet. So the penguins get moved out, and there's now a great debate about what to do with this. It's a very famous piece of modern, really almost sculpture rather than architecture. But anyway, poor penguins no longer do this anymore. That's what it looks like without penguins. See, it's rather a wonderful structure. Abstract art, of course, is coming in. This is a British version from before the Second World War. And then after the war, modernism becomes associated with the revival of the city, of the nation. This is a wonderful concert hall on the river. It's called the South Bank. We'll come back to that. And then, of course, also housing becomes an enormous, so much was destroyed in London, and so much was anyway, awful slums. So people had to be rehoused. So there are these new tower blocks. Here they are in this kind of wonderful forested area in the 50s and 60s. And then brutalism, this very sculptural, tough style, which comes in the 70s. This is the National Theatre, which I actually don't like very much at all, but anyway, looks better at night. Well, this complex of buildings called the Barbican. Very sculptural, very tough enclave of buildings with nice water features and gardens. So it actually works very well. Modernism, of course, high modernism, glass and steel, very much part of the new city, the city of finance, international finance, and so on. This is a famous building with the services on the outside. And we'll end with this. This is what happens after that, what's called postmodernism, which is this kind of weird, playful way of approach to architecture. Here in a building which is on a hinge between, the center of London's financial district, and down here is Cheapside. You see the Church of St. Mary the Bow down there. So that's a very quick run through of what you can see as you move around London. There's a lot more, obviously, but I've recorded this. I'm going to make it available to you. So if you want to run over it, and then perhaps next time we can talk about what strikes you about it, or anything perhaps you've thought of that could have been added. Okay, so let's end that there. Stop share. Okay. Yes. Start recording. Okay, that's good.